All right, awesome. So last time we were talking about economics and how the environment kind of fits into it, and talked about this idea that what we might consider like a conventional view of economics is really embedded in this system where the environment provides resources and accepts waste. And then the way the environment naturally works, of course, is that there's recycling in the sense that ecosystem services make waste available as nutrients, provide these services over here for our economies to work. And then again, we talked about this idea of non-market values and how this is problematic because if the values of the environment don't show up in a ledger anywhere, then it's real hard to use an economic perspective to value it, right? And then we just started talking a little bit about environmental policy and the idea that a policy just means it's a sort of a formalized set of plans and principles that are going to help guide our questions and our decision making. Let's see here. So the question then is like why do we need an environmental policy, right? Like why is this something we have to think about? Any thoughts? You're like, well, you're going to tell us anyway, so maybe. Do you guys know that feeling when like you don't know something and you're about to know something, and then after you know it, you're going to know it for the rest of your life? Do you ever get that feeling? I don't know. I kind of got that feeling right now. Yeah. So the main idea, circling back to markets and economies, is what we call market failure. And what this means is that when we think about any transaction, say you're buying a ream of paper, which will fit into an example we're going to use in a second. When there's a transaction going on, sometimes all the costs and benefits are not expressed in that transaction. And this can go down a couple of different ways, and then I'll share an example here. One of the ways that happens is in the tragedy of the commons, and this is what Eleanor Ostrom was writing about as well as that NASA Geographic article. So what is the overall issue with the tragedy of the commons? Anybody glean that from the article?
People are going to use public resources as much as they can because they don't want to feel like other people are using it with them and then they're missing out.
Exactly. So the thought comes from the idea of a town common. So it used to be back in the day that when towns were constructed, there was an area in the center of town where there weren't any houses or anything built. The land was just kind of left the sort of a pasture, and that was called the town common. And so here you can see, there's just this area in the middle of town where there aren't any houses built or anything. And common means that it's a common resource. It means it belongs to everybody. This is the resource that belongs to the whole town. Okay, now just as an example, this is a common resource. And so imagine that I'm raising goats, it could be, right? Let's say I have my goat, and I take it down and let it graze in the common. And each of y'all brings your goat down to the commons. And at the end of the day, right, we take our goats back, but as we're walking back, we realize, you know what? There's still a lot of grass left there. What if I bring 2 goats? Right? It's not going to cost me, I'm not paying for that grass that it's, what if I bring 2 goats? All right, so I come the next day with 2 goats, and then what do you think? Heck, we all need to bring 2 goats, right? So everybody brings 2 goats. And so pretty quick, what happens is, all of a sudden, that resource is being used at a level that it can't sustain. So all of a sudden, we've all brought, I don't know what it is, 2, 3, 4 goats. The grass is all consumed, and the resource is gone for everyone. All right, so that's what's called the tragedy of the commons. And there are a few assumptions that have to occur for the tragedy of the commons to take place. The first is the shared resource system. So the article about Eleanor Ostrom talks about clean air as a shared resource, right? Or our global climate is a shared resource. It's something that we all need. Can you think of any other examples of a shared resource? Soil. Yeah, we could probably come up with lots of examples. So there's a shared resource system. But the way that the tragedy of the commons happens is that the individual users, myself with my goat, y'all with your goats, act in a way that promotes our own self-interest at the expense of the common good, right? So it would be best for that village if we had grass on that common year-round, so we could all take our one goat down there and use it. But I don't individually benefit as much from just bringing one goat down as I do if I bring 2 or 3 goats down. So there's this conflict between what benefits the individual and what benefits the common good, right? So when people act in a way that furthers their own self-interest at the expense of the common good, that can lead to this. And so, of course, the end result then is depletion or spoiling of the resource. So yeah, we've seen this with soil degradation. And soil is an interesting one, yeah, because soil in the town common is a common resource. But soil, if it's, for instance, like in the farmer's field where they own the land, like that, in that case, like would not be a common resource. So some resources are common in some settings, but not others. Any other examples of where we might see this happen, this tragedy of the commons? Any thoughts? So we've got the example of air, right, of global air as a resource. Mm-hmm. Water? Uh-huh. Sure. Yeah. Any other examples that come to mind? Yeah, oil and coal is an interesting one. Yeah, so, yeah, and like some oil, for instance, is in international waters, right? You have to go down deep to get it, so that would definitely be a common resource. Yeah, absolutely. Depending on where they're located, those certainly could be. Interestingly, traffic congestion is sort of an example of a tragedy of the commons, where we have a shared resource, which is like the amount of area on our road, and you know, it would get us to work and back most efficiently if we carpooled, although not in this COVID era, or rode public transportation. But you know, I want to be in my own car, someone says, like with my own tunes and all this kind of stuff. And so we're all in our own vehicle, and as a result, like here we are, we've got 1 million cars here, and it makes it more challenging for everyone. There's different examples. Global fisheries is one of the best known examples. So once you get outside of 100 miles away from the coast, you're in international waters. And so in international waters, anyone can fish. Anyone from any country can fish. Now, there are treaties and things now, but when it first started, anyone could fish there. And so what we saw, this is data from a paper. Each of these panels represents a different fishery. So like the tropical Atlantic, tropical Indian Ocean, tropical Pacific, all over the world, right? And then on the x-axis here, we've got years starting from 1970 or the 60s up to the end of the 20th century. And you can see in every one of these single fisheries, just a real dramatic decline, right? Massive declines in fisheries. Because what was each of those people in that boat thinking as they're fishing and they see the other boats fishing? Yeah, they wanted more. They're thinking like, man, if I don't catch those tuna, the dude in that boat from this other country is going to get him, right? So, yeah.
If 12 miles out to sea is non-territorial for anyone, then why is 100 miles out the mark for international waters?
You know, it probably varies, and I might have screwed that up actually. Is it? Yeah.
Once you come to 12 miles of land of another country or another territory, 12 miles officially marks their land.
Right,
And
right.
if you go any farther out, I just
Yeah, that's, you know, I'd have to research that. I have that number in my head, but it might not be completely correct. And the other thing is, like, different countries have different treaties for fisheries, but so wherever the boundary is, international waters is where this has happened. So yeah, I'll have to look up where I got that number.
I was wondering where the difference was. 'Cause,
Yeah.
I mean, it could be a military thing, fisheries could be a whole separate thing. I just wasn't sure where the boundary of international was if territorial began to fall.
Well, I have 100 in my head, but I need to verify that. And it's probably one of those things I've had in my head for a long time that I've forgotten where I got that from. So I will research that and get back, or yeah, sounds like you've researched it already. So
That's just something I'm not.
yeah, that's good to know. So anyway, yeah, so the point is, like, with the common resource we have, this pretty dramatic decline. All right, so this is something that's happened all over the world, and there are a couple of solutions that have been proposed. So Garrett Hardin on the top here is the person that first put forth this idea. And how did he propose solving the tragedy of the commons? What was his approach? Anybody recall from the Ostrom article? So he basically said there's two ways you can solve this. You either have to privatize the resources, because in the example of that town common, imagine that, I don't know, let's say there's 100 of us in our town, right? And so instead of having this whole town common of shared resources, let's say instead we divide it up into 100 little pieces and we each get a piece of it. Well, now I'm not going to overgraze it because I know I've got that same block next year, and that if I graze all the grass all the way down, that's not going to benefit me. And I also know that if I just graze half of that, I'll be able to use the other half, right? Someone won't come in and use it. So he said there's only two ways you can solve the tragedy of the commons. The first is to privatize resources. The second option, and this is what's happened with global fisheries, is to impose regulations. And so we see a lot of treaties between countries, laws that regulate how much you can and can't harvest. So Hardin came at it from that particular perspective. We either have to privatize resources or impose strict regulations. And as your article talked about, Eleanor Ostrom, on the other hand, who won the Nobel Prize in economics, took this idea and then she tried to see how common the tragedy of the commons was out in the world. And as she described, she found all these examples of people like working together. And so what she proposed was that, another way around this, which a lot of people are actually doing, is community organization and self-regulation. What's the difference in the approaches of Hardin as opposed to Ostrom? What's maybe like some of the fundamental differences there? Any thoughts? Oh, sorry, yeah. Accountability? Uh-huh. Yeah, what were you going to share?
It's like kind of how much do you trust yourself?
Yeah, it's like trust at the local level, right? For Ostrom's ideas to work. There was one comment over here too, I think, unless I misheard. Yeah, so this idea of like the level of regulation, where the trust is, you might say that like Hardin's idea is kind of like top-down regulation, that like you have to have restrictive rules from the top down. And Ostrom's is more bottom-up. The idea is that the communities that are actually involved in accessing these resources are the ones that need to do it, right? That they can organize and self-regulate. So some real interesting assumptions about how human nature works, I think, behind each of these two approaches, which is interesting, I think. So let's just take maybe about 5 minutes or so and locate yourself to where you can talk to one or two of your colleagues across these plexiglass boundaries. And I'd like you to think about two things. This example in the article that we discussed involves this local fishery in Baja California, right? What do you think allowed this cooperative in Baja California to thrive? What was it? What were some things about that setting, maybe, that allowed Ostrom's ideas to come to fruition, essentially? And then maybe the next question, are there places where it might be more challenging to implement Ostrom's ideas, right? Of like the self-regulation and community organization, right? So let's take about five minutes or so, just share what ideas you have on those topics. She lays out 8 different principles, and I'm not going to ask you to list all of these, but I just thought it'd be nice to go through to like, based on her study around the world, like what has to be in place for this system to work. And y'all have touched on a lot of these already. Y'all have already kind of pointed these out. So there have to be clearly defined boundaries. So like talking about Asheville as like people coming and going, it's harder for that to work when all the resource users aren't right there. Locally tailored rules. The local individuals affected by the rules participate in the rulemaking. Resource monitors that are accountable. So again, holding everyone accountable. Graduated penalties on rule breakers. Conflict management institutions. This one, right? Authority is recognizing a right to self-organize, right? It'd be real important that, the province, the city, the district where this is happening, like recognize like the right of those local fishermen to work together and organize together and didn't try to impose things. So you can see, it's not always going to work necessarily. And I'm curious, out of this list of 8, which do y'all think might be the most challenging? Realizing that people have done it, so we're certainly not going to say it's impossible. We're certainly not going to say we can't. But what might be some of these most challenging principles from Ostrom's study? Any thoughts? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point, right? Especially, as you get more and more users, right? Like you need in some cases, some pretty complicated infrastructure maybe to do that, right? And again, like that gets to this like human nature part of the question. Like, are they all your buddies that you can just trust that they're going to do what they need to do, right? Or are there people that not necessarily everyone trusts, and so you've got to like be checking everybody's harvest when they come in every day, right? Cool. Other thoughts? Mm-hmm.
I think that would be maybe not the most challenging, but something that is really important because it's like outside companies come in and like try to make a business out of the resources that are local to that area, so they may not respect those rules because they are an outside company and don't understand how the environment is regarded in that community. Mm-hmm.
Right, and that's sort of the multinational company model that we see in so many places now where the activity of resource extraction isn't necessarily done by the local folks anymore. And so, right, in that case, then that assumption kind of falls apart. So I don't know, so just to be honest, when I first started teaching this class, it was really just about harden, and it was really just about like tragedy of the commons is like inevitable if you got a common resource, like it's going to be used up. It's human nature to just be greedy and want to get as much as you can. But then it was cool when I came, Ostrom, you don't hear a whole lot about her, but then when I kind of came across her ideas, it's like, wow, like this works as well. And so anyway, so just there's this model where you don't have to privatize everything, and you don't have to have real strict top-down government regulation if you've got this, right? If you've got these strong local communities that are involved in the process. So I try to share good news. I try to give you guys as much good news as I can because it keeps me happy too. All right, let's see. How are we doing on time here? Cool. All right, so back to our outline here then. So market failure is why we need an environmental policy, because the environment is not being taken into account in all of our economic models. Another important concept are what are called externalities. And we talked about how one of the assumptions of neoclassical economics is that all the costs and benefits of a transaction are contained in that transaction. In other words, if something is cheaper for me to buy, I'm assuming that the person I'm buying it from is the only one that's been affected by all the cost of production. So it's not that someone else is paying a cost of production, just this person who's selling it to me is. So externality means that the production or consumption of goods or services impacts a third party that is not directly related to the product or the consumption of that good or service. And I'm going to go through an example of this, and I think it'll become clearer just what an externality looks like. And then there's also the problem of the free rider. What does it mean when we talk about a free rider?
Someone who takes or benefits from the common kind of good, but doesn't contribute to it at all.
Exactly, yeah. So a free rider is someone or something that receives a benefit without paying for it. So the question of like why we need to think about an environmental policy and not just sort of let the market take care of valuing the environment is really driven by these three ideas. So the first is that, common resources, things kind of fall apart, right? The valuation of a common resource falls apart when we're focused on kind of individual gain, in some cases. The second is that we sometimes have externalities in place, which is where entities not directly related to the production or consumption of a good or service are either and then the third is this free rider problem. Is anybody still writing that down? I don't want to move on too quickly. Okay, see something. All right, so I like to talk about this using the example of a paper mill. Anybody here from Canton, North Carolina? It's a paper mill in Canton, so that's why I always ask. Can I go ahead and move on now? All right, okay. All right. So if you're going to construct paper, you need water. It's a very water-intensive process. So when we look at where paper mills are located, they're on the banks of rivers. So I'm going to draw a river. I'm going to draw another river. This is a river. The water is flowing. All right, now imagine we've got a village down here. These are houses. These are not little arrows. These are houses. Now, the people that live in this town next to the river, what are they probably getting from that river? Water. So yeah, water, drinking water, whatever else, right? Bathing, washing, all that kind of stuff. What else? Yep, could be hunting, could be fishing. They're getting probably some food from that river. Okay. And let's just say for our example that this is a river that it hasn't been polluted. It's got clean water. It's in pretty good shape. Okay. All right. Now let's say that I come in and I build a paper mill here. Factory, got some smokestacks here. It's kind of like a birthday cake, but in fact it's a paper mill. I'll write it on there just so you can tell. So as part of my process of making paper, I need to bring in a lot of water. And so I divert some of this water into my paper mill. And then the water that I've used, I put back into the river. Now, let's just say, for argument's sake, that I don't treat this wastewater at all when I put it back into the river. So what's going to happen to the quality of that river water downstream? Going down, right? So now what's that going to do to the people's here ability to get what they were getting from the river? Yeah, so we've got our little fishies in here, you know. We've got fishes, all that kind of thing. So when there's this pollution in the river now, it's probably going to kill some of those fishes. It's going to make the water so that they can't drink it anymore. So what are they going to have to do to get their drinking water now? Could get it from rainwater? Yeah, they could get it from somewhere else. They're going to have to spend some money and put some time and effort into getting water from another source, right? Same thing for their food now, right? If the river there isn't able to support the fish that they've been eating before, maybe the animals they were hunting before, then they're going to have to get that somewhere else. And they're going to have to expend energy and resources to do that. Okay. So, because this paper is being made, these folks down here have actually incurred a cost. Now, are they benefiting at all from the manufacturing of the paper? The way that I've described it, they haven't, right? I mean, now, it could be possible that some of these folks might work at the factory, that kind of thing. But for this example, let's just say we're far enough downstream and these folks are not working there. So the people in this village are experiencing an external cost, right? So the cost of producing this paper is being experienced by these people over here who aren't at all involved in the transaction. In other words, when someone takes a ream of paper to the market and sells it, these folks aren't benefiting from it at all. Yet they're paying a cost for the production of the paper in like decrease in their water quality, so they have to pay to get their water somewhere else. Decrease in like their food resources, so they have to pay to get their food in it from another place, right? So this is what we mean when we talk about an external cost. Does that make sense so far? Now, if I want to create an environmental policy to correct this, what would be a way to do it? So one thing you could do is you could require the paper mill to treat its water, right? So we could come in and we could put a water treatment facility in there. Now, is it gonna be cheaper or more expensive for me making my paper to have a water treatment facility there now? I'm gonna have to build it, right? I'm gonna have to build the thing. So it's gonna cost more for me to make my paper if I'm treating all the wastewater and making sure the water's clean before I put it back in. But what have we done now? We've taken this cost, which was external at first, the water pollution was an external cost, and now we've put it in to the cost of production. So with our water treatment here, we've put this external cost of production back into the cost here. So now myself, who's benefiting from the production and sale of the paper, is paying that cost. So here's the thing. Here's a question for you. Does an external cost make a good or service cheaper or more expensive? It depends on who you're talking about paying. And I should have specified my question. For the person who goes and buys the ream of paper, does having external costs make that paper cheaper or more expensive? That's why I asked the question. Imagine that I'm selling my paper and y'all are living downstream and I'm not cleaning the water. And so, you know, I get to make that paper real cheaply because I don't have to treat my water. That cost is external because y'all in the village are paying it. So when the costs are external, it actually makes the price go down because somebody else is paying that cost. Like it's not part of my cost of production to treat the water because I'm just dumping it into the river and the cost is being borne by the folks downstream. But then when we put that external cost back into the cost of production, the amount of money it costs me to make my paper goes up. So then I have to turn around and sell my paper for more. And, you know, you could argue that the cost of paper is always the same. It's just who's paying it, right? Like, so external costs mean that someone who isn't benefiting from the transaction is paying it. Whereas no external costs means like the producer is paying all the production costs. So they have to raise the price to incorporate those costs. Yeah.
So is it then safe to assume that in all circumstances, the price of production is cheaper, the price of consumption is always cheaper? Can we go ahead and assume that's still going to be a variable regardless?
Yeah, well, so it depends on the profit margin, of course, right? Like how much people mark things up. Like however much it costs me to make that paper, maybe I mark it up more. So you still need a profit, right? Yeah. So yeah, I'm not going to address it all like, I don't know, like how much profit they make. The main thing to keep in mind is that when costs are external, it keeps production costs lower to the person who's making it. So there are all sorts of ways you can externalize costs. So the conflict then, right, is that when I'm making my paper, I don't want to have to create a facility to clean my water because it's going to cost me more because it's going to make my paper more expensive. But the people downstream want me to treat my wastewater so that they're not going to pay the cost of me making paper. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah.
I'm just curious, wouldn't it be argued that after the first external cost is made internal, the people that are then having to pay more money for the paper are experiencing another external cost? Because they are not benefiting from the water being treated at all. They're just having to pay more money for the paper.
Super good question. So what we would say is that the true cost of making paper includes the cost of water pollution, right? So basically, until we internalized that cost, the paper was artificially cheap. They weren't really paying the true cost of that paper, you know? Because you can almost think of like the people downstream subsidizing their paper because they're paying the cost with having to get water somewhere else and food somewhere else. So before we internalized that cost, people weren't paying the true cost of that paper, if that makes sense.
Does that mean it reaches an equilibrium? Or does it go back forward?
So once we've internalized all those external costs, then what we would say is that the consumer is paying the true cost of that product.
So is the true cost the equilibrium?
Yeah. Yeah, equilibrium is a good way to think of it. If you want to think of like, yeah, exactly, the cost the consumer pays being equal to the true cost of production. I think that's a good way to think of it. Yeah, you could, yeah. I haven't heard it quite expressed that way, but that makes a lot of sense. And if they're not in equilibrium, someone else is paying the cost, right? So, you know, and so there are all sorts of environmental examples of this, right? With farming, if the rivers can also get polluted, it's all about rivers. I study rivers and fish, right? You'd never know that from my mask. So like when farmers plow right down to the edge of the river, you get lots of erosion and lots of sediment gets into the streams, and it decreases the quality of the streams. And you could tell farmers, well, if you don't mow, if you don't, plant crops in that 10 meters right along the band of the river, it'll help the water quality. But the farmer might say, I'm not going to make as much money if I don't put all of that land under agriculture production, right? So the farmer is getting to make more money in that sense by polluting the water. And so people downstream again pay that cost to keep the agriculture production cheaper. And so agriculture products, for instance, are cheaper than they really should be. So this is one thing that we see, right? In the desire to make products cheaper, companies often overlook these external costs. And a lot of them are environmental costs, right? Any questions about that? Thoughts about that?
When you said it's not in equilibrium, someone else is paying the cost. What's an example of how so if you, like for the paper mill example, since the paper mill company put in the water treatment facility, they still have to pay more for their production because they're treating the water, and then their consumers are gonna pay more. People in the village don't have to pay the extra to have like external water sources, and like external food sources. So is it like an equilibrium because like the village doesn't have to pay more?
Right. It's an equilibrium because the only ones that are paying costs are involved in the transaction. So the company that makes and sells the paper and the consumer that buys the paper. And remember, that's one of our assumptions of neoclassical economics, is that all costs and benefits are internal to the transaction. Because otherwise, when we have external costs, right? Imagine that I'm making my paper this way and I don't have my paper and I don't have my water treatment plant. You're making your paper and you do have a water treatment plant. Well, your paper is going to be more expensive. So who's going to buy your paper, right? Maybe you put a sticker on there that says, produced in a factory that treats all of its wastewater. Well, maybe some people will be okay with paying more for that. But other folks are like, well, this is my budget for my back to school supplies. I'm going to buy the paper that's cheapest. And so that increases and that encourages environmental degradation in the sense that what the market tells you is the best deal is only the best deal because people outside of the transaction are paying some of the costs. So the producer isn't paying all those costs. So economists have spent a lot of time on this idea, like how do you put those external costs back into the cost of production? And Y'all can take Dr. Leah Matthews' course on environmental economics and learn a whole lot more about this than I know. But it's one way to, one way to think about it. Any other questions or comments on that?